He's not considered a presidential frontrunner, but Ron Paul's raised tens of millions of dollars from a devoted base, many of them young people who love his libertarian straight talk.
The role, of course, is to return this country to sanity.
But how's this for straight talk? June 1992, right after the LA riots. In a copy obtained by CNN of the Ron Paul Political Report, one of several newsletters published in his name during the 1980s and 90s, quote, order was only restored in LA when it came time for the blacks to pick up their welfare checks. Another excerpt. The criminals who terrorize our cities in riots and on every non-riot day are not exclusively young black males, but they largely are. As children, they are trained to hate whites, to believe that white oppression is responsible for all black ills, to fight the power, to steal and loot as much money from the white enemy as possible. None of the articles we found say who wrote them. Ron Paul's spokesman says those words, published between Paul's two stints as a U.S. congressman from Texas, were not written by Paul, and he finds them abhorrent. Not good enough for one political veteran.
These stories may be very old in Ron Paul's life, but they're very new to the American public, and they deserve to be totally ventilated. I must say, I don't think it's an excuse in politics to have somebody go out under your name and say, oh, by the way, I didn't write that.
In some excerpts, the reader may be led to believe the words are Ron Paul's. In the Ron Paul Political Report in October 1992, the writer describes carjacking as the hip-hop thing to do among the urban youth who play unsuspecting whites like pianos, writes about advice from others on how to avoid carjacking. Then, I frankly don't know what to make of such advice, but even in my little town of Lake Jackson, Texas, I've urged everyone in my family to know how to use a gun in self-defense, for the animals are coming. Paul's spokesman says Paul has lived in Lake Jackson for years, but says Paul never wrote that, is saddened that someone took advantage of him, and points to Paul's statement saying, I have publicly taken moral responsibility for not paying closer attention to what went out under my name. We spoke to the editor of Reason, a libertarian magazine which shares some of Paul's beliefs on big government. He says he's never heard Paul speak like that, but
what he has not done, and what I think some people are looking for him to do, is to say, okay, who wrote what? I mean, there's 20 years, give or take, worth of newsletters there.
Newsletters that rant against Martin Luther King, the Israeli lobby, gays, and AIDS victims. Many of them were reported this week by the New Republic magazine. There's one newsletter addressing American militias, ranting against the federal government, saying if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. That's from January 1995, just as Ron Paul was getting set to take office in his second stint in Congress. Paul's spokesman says the candidate doesn't know who wrote any of them. When we asked if Mr. Paul would try to find out, the spokesman said, no, what's the point? This is 15 years old. It's time to move on. Brian Todd, CNN, Washington.
And Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul is joining us now live from the campaign trail in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Congressman, thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
All right, let's talk about it. How could this happen? Because I've gone through some of these old Ron Paul newsletters, and it's got your name bannered on the top, and some of these comments, as we just heard from Brian's piece, are pretty shocking.
Yeah, it is, and of course it's been rehashed a long time and it's coming up now for political reasons. But everybody knows in my district that I didn't write them and I don't speak like that, and nobody has heard me ever say anything like that. And I've been reelected time and time again, so everybody knows that I don't participate in that type of language. But the point is when you bring this question up, you're really saying you're a racist or are you a racist? And the answer is no, I'm not a racist. Matter of fact, Rosa Parks is one of my heroes. Martin Luther King is a hero because they practiced the libertarian principle of civil disobedience, nonviolence. Libertarians are incapable of being a racist because racism is a collectivist idea. You see people in groups. A civil libertarian like myself see everybody as an important individual. It's not the color of their skin that is important, as Martin Luther King said. What is important is the character of the individual. You know what is really interesting, though, and this might be behind this, because I, as a Republican candidate, probably am getting the most number of black votes and black supporters, and now that has to be undermined. And I do this because I attack two wars that blacks are suffering from. One, the war overseas. In all wars, minorities suffer the most. So they join me in this position I have against the war in Iraq. And what about the war on drugs? What other candidate will stand up and frighten the candidate and say, I would pardon all blacks, all whites, everybody who are convicted for nonviolent drug acts and drug crimes? And this is where the real discrimination is. Let me finish this because I got to get get my message back because you put the other message out. Now, if you want to look for discrimination, it's in the judicial system. 14% of the inner city blacks commit drug crime. 67% of blacks are in prison. That's discrimination. That's the judicial code that I am attacking, and that is not racism. What I defend is the principle of libertarianism, where we never see people who belong to a group, and every individual is defended and protected because they're important in the individual, not because of their color of skin, but of their character. So I am the anti-racist because I am the only candidate, Republican or Democrat, who would protect the minority against these vicious drug laws.
Congressman, there's a lot of material there, but let me just try to figure out, how did this stuff get in these Ron Paul newsletters? Who wrote it?
Well, I have no idea. Have you ever heard of a publisher of a magazine not knowing every single thing? The editor is responsible for the daily activities, and people came and go, and there were some people that were hired. I don't know any of their names. I do not, absolutely honestly, do not know who wrote those things. But I do know there was a transition, there were changes around, and to me, it's been rehashed. This is the politics of it all. If it were important enough, why didn't the people in my district who have heard this for these 10 years or so, it came up and people believe me? Why don't you believe me and just say, look, it's in there, it's bad, I recognize that, I had a moral responsibility, but that doesn't mean that you can, indirectly charge me as being a racist, and that is what is being done, and yet I am the most anti-racist because I don't see people in collective groups, and I practice, and right now, even before this thing broke, guess when our next fundraising day, our next super day? We raised $4 million one day, 6 on the next one's on Martin Luther King holiday. I mean, this is it. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Gandhi, they're the heroes of mine in practice of civil disobedience to try to get the burden of government off our backs, and that's why I'm the one that protects the individual blacks who are in the city who are so unfairly being treated and thrown in prison. That's the message that needs to be heard, and I'd appreciate somebody helping bring that out rather than nitpicking over something done many years ago, which I did not write.
Did you used to read these newsletters, Congressman?
Not back then. There might have been at times I would, at times, but I was in a medical practice. I traveled a lot. I was doing speeches around the country, so very frequently, I never did see these. Matter of fact, some of the things you just read, I wouldn't have recognized them. And the point is, it's not part of my character. The point also is when people get charged, they usually have a clip. They never have a clip of somebody saying something, a slip of the tongue or something, and then they're blasted, the kingdom come. Nobody has ever heard me say that. They know those are not my thoughts, and therefore the people have not rejected me in Texas. And in a way, this is a bit of a witch hunt. I know there's reason. I don't say that you're unjustified in asking the question, but you also have to think of the motivation behind this. And maybe this is part of the anti-Ron Paul deal. I got excluded from the debates the other night. And maybe this is part knock down Ron Paul because he's gaining grounds with the blacks. I'm getting more votes right now and more support from the blacks because they understand what I'm talking about and they trust me.
I got to tell you, Congressman, you and I, we've talked a lot over these past several months. And when I saw these newsletters, I didn't know anything about them until I saw that article in the New Republic. I was pretty shocked because it certainly didn't sound like the Ron Paul that I've come to know and our viewers have come to know all this time. I just want to be clear because this is a chance for you to respond. You repudiate all of these racist comments, all of the slurs that are contained, even though it contains the name Ron Paul in these newsletters.
Well, the most important thing is anything I've ever said in my life has repudiated that for years and years and years. So I do repudiate everything that is written along those lines and what I heard tonight. And like I say, I've never read that before. If you asked me to dig up a copy of that, I wouldn't have the vaguest idea. That's how unimportant it was to me. But obviously it is important. It needs to be ironed out. In many ways, Wolf, I think I should thank you for bringing it about so I could clarify this and make sure everybody knew where I stood on this position. because it's obviously wrong. Nobody, people who know me, nobody is going to believe this. Absolutely nobody. Just like you said, you've known me for a good many years and good many interviews, and that's just not my language. That's not my life. I mean, I honor and respect the civil rights movement and the civil disobedience. And right now, I really think that people have to think about the real discrimination in this country today has to do with the drug laws. And what other candidate would take it upon himself to challenge this whole system of the judiciary, which is so unfair to the minorities? Now, talk about that. That's what I want the people to hear. And out of fairness, that message needs to get out.
Ron Paul joining us from South Carolina. Thanks very much. You want to be president of the United States, you're going to have to expect a lot of scrutiny. All the candidates go through it. You're going through it right now yourself.
Understand.